I've watched 5 World Cups in my lifetime: 98, 02, 06, 2010, and 2014. And I want to just dedicate this video to all of the pleasant surprises in all 5 of those World Cup tournaments that I've been witness to over the last 20 plus years. Um, this is just a video shortly talking about all of the upset teams that made deep runs into the World Cups um, over the span of the last 2 decades. And you guys, if you're older than me or younger than me, you're welcome to share some of your memories of the World Cup below, of surprise teams advancing to the quarterfinals, semifinals, etc. I remember in France '98, I was a little kid. Croatia finishing in third place. Really unexpected. This is a team that, in the FIFA rankings, just a few months before the '98 World Cup started, was a new country because they had just broken off from the former Yugoslavia a few years before, and they were ranked 123 in the world. So it was absolutely incredible. That was an amazing Croatian side with a golden generation of players that finished in third, and in France '98 could have gotten to the final. They almost beat the host nation in the semis. That remains to this day probably the biggest surprise that I have seen in a World Cup. 2002, of course, South Korea co-hosts getting to the semifinals, knocking off really big name sides like Portugal, Italy, and Spain in the group stage, the round of 16, and the quarterfinals. Now, that run is mired in a lot of controversy because a lot of people feel that the referees either made horrible mistakes or they were paid off by FIFA to help South Korea get as far as they could, because it was part of FIFA's overall attempt to extend the marketability, the popularity of the sport in Asia, since this was the first World Cup ever held in Asia. And South Korea getting to the semifinals, to this day, remains one of the biggest controversies in World Cup history. But whether or not they made it on their own accord, or if they were helped along the way, that is a matter for debate. That's not what this video is about. You kind of have to give them the benefit of the doubt until any evidence or proof is presented. Personally, I think there were some really bad refereeing mistakes that got them there, but the achievement itself needs to be noted. They got the first ever and only ever Asian side to get to the semifinals of the World Cup, where they finished in fourth place ultimately. That year was a particularly special World Cup because you had at least 3 or 4 surprise teams make it to the quarterfinals. And I think it was the first and only World Cup to this day, 2002, where the quarterfinals had at least one team from every continent in the world. Senegal, coming off that surprise victory against the defending champions France in the first match. That was the opening game of 2022 as well. For those of you who remember, Senegal defeating Thierry Henry's French team, and going on an incredible run to the quarterfinals. Turkey, this was their first World Cup in, I think, 50 or so years, more than 50 years. They ended up as third place finishers, right ahead of South Korea. The United States getting to the quarterfinals as well. Arguably, we should have gotten to the semifinals if not from that handball by Torsten Frings off that Michael Ballack free kick in that quarterfinal clash against Germany. So this was a very special World Cup. It was very unpredictable and very volatile. The United States, Turkey, South Korea, and Senegal, all 4 of those countries getting to the quarterfinals. Again, you had representation from every continent in the world in that World Cup, with the exception of Oceania. But that was something that is unlikely to be repeated for a very long time. Fast forward to 2006, it was a very unsurprising tournament because 7 of the 8 quarterfinalists were teams that you could have easily said before the tournament started on paper, yeah, they're getting to the quarters. There were not very many surprises in that tournament. A lot of the expected teams that were expected to come through their groups did get through. The one surprise from 2006, however, was Ukraine. Ukraine, this was their first ever World Cup as an independent nation. They got to the quarterfinals of 2006 after beating the Swiss, kind of luckily on penalties prior in the round of 16. But for Ukraine to finish in the final 8 of a World Cup tournament, that was a special event for them. So they were the surprise of that year's World Cup. 2010, you had a couple. We had Ghana getting to the quarterfinals, becoming the third African nation in history to reach a World Cup quarterfinal, almost becoming the first African semifinalists ever, just barely, but losing out on a penalty shootout to Uruguay. And another surprise that year, I think, was Paraguay. Paraguay, South American team, getting to their first ever quarterfinal. They almost eliminated Spain, the eventual champions. We could have had Paraguay in the semis. It was also a sort of renaissance, a rebirth, the return of Uruguay after so many decades in the wilderness of not coming back to their previous World Cup glory from 1930 and 1950. Uruguay getting to the semifinals of that tournament. That was a little bit of a surprise. Not as much as Ghana and Paraguay, but it was pretty unexpected. And then in 2014, it's Costa Rica, without a doubt, getting paired into the toughest group of the World Cup by far, with three former world champions, England, Uruguay, and Italy, getting 7 points. Everyone wrote them off. Everyone said they were going to be the easy pickings of the group. Finished with 0 points, but they nearly beat everyone in that group. They conceded 2 goals throughout the entire tournament with an excellent defense that was lined up by Jorge Luis Pinto, who's now the coach of Honduras. And they came a penalty shootout away against the Dutch from reaching the semifinals, becoming the first CONCACAF side to reach the semifinals of World Cup since the very first World Cup in 1930. That's how close Costa Rica came. They technically did not lose any games that World Cup because penalty shootouts get recorded as a draw. So they won and drew all of their games, only going out on penalties to the Dutch. So Costa Rica in 2010 was another special story. And guys, because of this, we're almost certainly going to have a surprise team in the quarterfinals of 2018 World Cup next year in Russia. The pattern just calls for it to happen. I just don't see how all of the mainstream sides that we expect to make it far into the tournament do so. There's always, you look at World Cups, especially in recent history, there's always at least that one surprise team. So 98 for me, it was Croatia. 2002, you had South Korea, Turkey, Senegal, and the USA. Really incredible. 2006 was Ukraine. 2010 was Ghana and Paraguay. To some extent, Uruguay as well. And in 2014, it was Costa Rica. So leave a comment below in the section. Who do you think could be potentially the next team to surprise at the 2018 World Cup in Russia? Who do you think could be a surprise team to make it to the quarterfinals? Because, guys, most likely there's going to be at least one. So I'm interested to see what you have to say below, and I will try to respond to them. So until then, guys, I'll see you in my next video. Peace out.